The recent sale of part of the state's shareholding in Russia's largest oil company, Rosneft, which was described as a way to help reduce the government's budget deficit, now looks like its aim is to boost Rosneft itself. The company is engaged in a bout of spending that appears designed to transform the once mainly domestic company into a diversified international oil company. Plans include acquiring shareholdings in foreign refineries, along with the exploration and development in frontier areas such as the Russian Arctic, and several projects are underway in Asia, including the acquisition of a large Indian refinery. Despite being partly privately owned, Rosneft acts in many ways more like a state oil company, in growing its international presence east of Suez, and is in line with the Moscow's policy of shifting Russia's international economic relations away from Western markets, where there is increasing hostility to Russia, in favour of Asia and the Middle East, where Russia is establishing a growing commercial and strategic presence. The eastward drift in Rosneft's activities is likely to prove costly, and the proceeds of the recent privatisation of part of the company will not be sufficient to fund all its future expenditure. Rosneft, however, is engaged in raising more capital from asset sales, having already sold stakes in some of its oil-producing ventures in Russia, and there's more set to follow. In December 2016, the government sold 19.5% of Rosneft for an estimated $11 billion. The buyers are reported to be the oil trading company Glencore and the Qatari Investment Authority, or QIA, which manages the sovereign wealth fund of the Middle Eastern country. QIA is also a shareholder in Glencore, and the sale was widely reported at the time to be aimed at boosting the government's coffers, thereby enabling it to reduce the budget deficit. This seems a little unlikely since the deficit is quite small in international terms. The Finance Ministry of Russia estimates that 2016's budget deficit was just under 3.6% of Russian GDP, and appears to be on schedule to go to zero annually by 2018, partly in response to the present recovery in global oil prices. Rosneft therefore looks more likely to be a destination for most of the money being raised. One question that's still to be answered, however, is the source of the funds involved in the purchase of the shareholding in Rosneft. Just under half of the $11 billion paid for the shares is reported to have been provided in the form of what was intended to be a loan to Glencore and QIA by a group of banks led by Italian Banca Inesta. It is not known which of the banks participated in the syndication, but there is speculation that the sum were Russian state banks, such as the Russian government may have privatised Rosneft in part with its own money. In October 2016, in a deal also described as a privatisation, Rosneft paid the government $5.3 billion for a 50% stake in the Russian sixth largest oil producer, Bashneft, giving Rosneft access to an additional 420,000 barrels per day of production, and raising its output to a total of 4.5 million barrels per day, 41% of Russia's total production of crude oil and natural gas liquids. But for all its recent expansion, Rosneft itself is not yet on a guaranteed path to growth. Its commercial activities are circumscribed both by financing and geology. Many of its older fields are on long-term decline, which impels it towards a strategy of acquisition of existing oil production and the exploration of new areas such as offshore in the Arctic, where its licenses to explore 28 blocks. Some of this can be only carried out by debt financing, adding to what many observers see as a worrying amount of existing debt. A further problem is the imposition of sanctions by the EU and the US over Russia's involvement in Ukraine, which affects Rosneft's access to Western finance and some advanced US technology. US sanctions have also prevented American companies from participating in a number of oil and gas ventures. ExxonMobil, for example, has been forced to suspend its activities in some joint ventures with Rosneft in Arctic projects in the Kara Sea, and Rosneft meanwhile is seeking greater involvement in upstream development projects in Russia from countries not involved in Western sanctions, such as India and China. It also needs to find more money for its activities, and asset sales look set to continue. In looking for partnerships with Indian, Chinese and other Asian countries, Rosneft is pursuing the Russian government's policy of reducing its reliance on Europe and the US. If Rosneft is to match the global players like Exxon or Royal Dutch Shell, it must continue to expand, it must diversify, and it will surely seek opportunities throughout Asia.